The wind across Kansas carried the dust of another dying town, and Wyatt Earp had grown tired of bearing his luck in places that didn't see to remember his name. The law had made him both feared and forgotten, a man who could bring order to chaos but never peace to himself. It was 1879 when he packed his saddlebags once more, leaving the noise of Dodge City behind. The iron tracks and saloon lights faded, replaced by the endless horizon of the West, a promise and a curse wrapped in sunlight and sand. He rode beside his brothers, Virgil and Morgan, both worn by years of enforcing a law that always seemed to bend for the wrong men. Behind them, in the shimmering heat, the frontier was changing. Towns were rising out of nothing, fortunes built on silver and sweat, and whispers of a new boomtown called Tombstone were spreading through the gambling halls like wildfire. Wyatt wasn't looking for redemption, not anymore. He wanted a place where a man could start again, maybe win enough to settle, maybe stop running. But the West had a way of calling men like him to the fire. The road to Tombstone was long and cruel. Coyotes howled in the distance, stars hung low over the desert, and each night the silence pressed closer. Virgil, ever the soldier, spoke of opportunity. Law work, steady pay. Morgan just wanted adventure, a story to tell. Wyatt said little. His thoughts drifted to a woman he once loved and buried, to the bodies of men he'd faced down in dusty streets, to the strange peace that always followed violence. When they reached Arizona territory, the land itself seemed alive, dry and restless. Tombstone appeared like a mirage. Tents, saloons, and shacks built fast and crooked, all clinging to the promise of silver buried beneath the earth. The streets buzzed with miners, drifters, gamblers, and women who sold dreams cheaper than whiskey. It smelled of sweat, smoke, and greed. Wyatt had seen enough frontier towns to know what came next. Where there was money, there was trouble. And where there was trouble, men like him found work. He took a room above the Oriental Saloon, a place run by men who didn't care how you made your living as long as you could pay for it. They knew his name, everyone did. Earp, they said, the man from Dodge. Some looked at him with respect, others with quiet hate. It didn't matter. Wyatt wasn't there to make friends. He started gambling again, dealing cards, watching men lose their tempers faster than their money. He moved through the room like a shadow, calm, unreadable, the way only a man who'd stared down death could be. It was there he met John Henry Holliday, Doc, pale, thin, coughing into a blood-stained handkerchief, but his eyes were sharp as glass. The two men circled each other over a game of faro, neither saying much at first, but when a drunk miner tried to draw a gun after losing his last dollar, Wyatt's hand moved quicker than thought, disarming him before Doc even blinked. Doc smiled then, that crooked, dangerous grin. "I believe we might just get along, Mr. Earp," he said in that soft Georgia drawl. From that moment they were bound, not by friendship at first, but by a mutual understanding. Both men had lived too long on the edge of the law to believe in saints. They trusted only each other. As weeks turned to months, Wyatt found himself pulled into the town's politics. Virgil took the badge of city marshal, trying to enforce order in a place built on chaos. Morgan joined him soon after. Wyatt resisted, at least at first. He'd worn the badge before. He knew what it cost. But when you watch men beaten in the streets, when you see the same outlaws swaggering into town drunk and armed, mocking the very idea of justice, something inside you stirs. That's how the Earps became the line between law and lawlessness in Tombstone. The opposition called themselves the Cowboys, a loose brotherhood of rustlers and killers led by Ike Clanton, Curly Bill Brocious, and Johnny Ringo. They wore red sashes and carried themselves like they owned the territory. Everyone in Tombstone feared them. Everyone but Wyatt. He studied them from a distance, learned their habits, their tempers. He knew men like that. They were wolves, brave only in a pack, and he had hunted wolves before. Tombstone was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Every arrest, every insult, every drunken threat brought them closer to the inevitable. Wyatt's nights grew longer, his sleep thinner. Doc stayed close, his laughter cutting through the tension like a blade. "You know, Wyatt," he said one evening as the sun bled red over the desert, "we're either going to die here or become legends." Wyatt looked at him, weary but certain. "Maybe both," he replied. In those words was the truth neither of them would admit. The West didn't make room for peace. It demanded a price, and in Tombstone that price would soon be paid in blood. The wind never really stopped in Tombstone. It howled through the crooked streets, sweeping dust across the faces of men who lived by their guns and died by them just as quick. Wyatt Earp stood on Fremont Street one gray morning, hat pulled low, eyes narrow, watching the town move like a restless beast. Tombstone was growing faster than it could handle. More silver, more saloons, more drifters, and more men who thought the law was just another game to play. Virgil wore the star now, city marshal, proud and stubborn. Morgan helped him keep order. Wyatt told himself he was just there to gamble, to keep an eye on things. But law was a sickness that always found its way back to him. He couldn't watch a man get beaten in the street without stepping in, couldn't listen to gunfire outside the saloon and pretend it wasn't his problem. Maybe he was addicted to control. Maybe he just hated chaos. But he knew deep down he needed the fight as much as it needed him. The cowboys gave him that fight. Ike Clanton, Curly Bill Brocious, and their red-sashed riders ruled the outskirts. They were a mixture of rustlers, killers, and drunkards, swaggering into town whenever they pleased, filling saloons with noise and fear. To most folks, they were a plague. To Wyatt, they were a test. He watched them closely, saying little, biding his time. Wyatt's silence unnerved them. He had a way of looking at a man that stripped away the lies, a calm that promised violence without ever raising his voice. Tombstone was dividing itself clean down the middle, those who wanted law and those who wanted freedom from it. In the middle of it all, Wyatt tried to balance both. Nights at the Oriental Saloon became tense. Doc Holliday sat at his usual table, a deck of cards in one hand and a whiskey glass in the other, coughing between hands but smiling like he knew how it all would end. "Wyatt," he said one night, voice low but sharp, "you keep chasing order in a place built by chaos. The desert doesn't care who's right. It only buries the losers." Wyatt didn't answer. He knew Doc was right, but some part of him still believed that law meant something, that a man S-word and his gun could still keep the world from falling apart. When the fights started, they were small things at first. A cowboy caught with stolen cattle, another drunk and waving his pistol in the street. Wyatt and Virgil would drag them off to jail, and by morning the judge would let them go. The cowboys laughed about it, swaggering out like they owned the town. But every insult chipped away at the fragile peace. Every smirk pushed Wyatt closer to the edge. Then came the night Curly Bill shot Marshal Fred White by mistake. Or so he claimed. Wyatt was there. He saw the smoke rise, saw White stumble and fall, saw the panic in Curly Bill's eyes as the weight of what he done sank in. Without hesitation, Wyatt stepped forward, knocked the gun from his hand, and clubbed him across the face with his own revolver. The town went still. Men watched, whispering. Nobody had ever laid a hand on Curly Bill and lived to tell about it. Wyatt dragged him to jail through the crowd, blood dripping from the outlaw's mouth. It was the moment everything changed. The cowboys would never forget that humiliation, and Wyatt knew it. From then on, the streets felt different. Faces turned when he passed. He could feel the eyes on him, the quiet hatred. But he didn't back down. If anything, he stood taller. Tombstone might have been built on silver, but its law was forged in fear, and Wyatt Earp had just reminded everyone who they should be afraid of. Days turned to weeks, tension growing like a storm on the horizon. There were brawls, threats, gunfire in the night. Each time, Wyatt and his brothers stood firm. Doc stayed close, though the cough was getting worse. He'd started carrying 2 pistols now, moving slower but shooting faster than anyone Wyatt had ever seen. "I'll tell you something, Wyatt," he said one morning after a gunfight outside the Alhambra. "The cowboys think they're wolves, but they've never seen what a real hunter looks like." Wyatt almost smiled. There was something about Doc's loyalty that ran deeper than blood. They were different kinds of men, but both understood the same truth. In a town like Tombstone, the law wasn't written in paper. It was carved into the dirt with lead. The lines between lawman and outlaw blurred with every passing day. Wyatt found himself drinking more, talking less. He'd begun to sense the change in his brothers, too. Virgil carried himself with a quiet weariness. Morgan's laughter came less often, replaced by a wary edge in his voice. They all knew it was only a matter of time before words turned to bullets. One afternoon, Ike Clanton confronted Wyatt in front of the Crystal Palace saloon. The street filled with onlookers. Ike's face was red, his hand twitching near his gun. "You think you run this town, Earp?" he snarled. "You and your fancy gambler friends? You don't scare me." Wyatt stepped forward, his expression cold, unreadable. "I don't need to scare you, Ike," he said evenly. "You'll do that to yourself." The words hit harder than any punch. Ike backed off that day, but his pride didn't heal. The next morning he was drunk again, shouting in the streets, swearing he'd kill every Earp he saw. And this time he wasn't alone. Wyatt knew the storm had finally found them. Virgil called for order, trying to keep the peace, but it was too late. The cowboys were circling, guns oiled, eyes wild. Wyatt sat in his room that night, cleaning his revolver by lamplight, the metallic click echoing through the silence. He looked out the window toward the dusty street below, where shadows moved like ghosts. Tombstone was ready to explode. Somewhere deep inside, he knew this was what he'd been walking toward all his life. Every gunfight, every dead man left behind had led to this place, this moment. He didn't want the blood, but he wouldn't run from it either. He holstered his gun, blew out the lamp, and said softly to no one, "Tomorrow's coming fast." Outside, the wind carried the sound of horses and boots. The night before OK Corral had begun. The morning of October 26, 1881, broke cold and sharp, sunlight cutting through the thin Arizona air like a blade. The streets of Tombstone were strangely quiet, too quiet for a town that usually roared to life before noon. Dust drifted through the alleys, stirred by a nervous wind that seemed to know something was coming. Wyatt Earp stepped out of the Cosmopolitan Hotel, his boots striking the boards with slow, deliberate weight. He wasn't wearing a badge. Virgil had taken command that day, but he didn't need one. His presence alone carried the authority of the law. Beside him walked Morgan, younger but already hardened, and Virgil, his right arm bound in a sling from an old wound but his eyes still sharp as steel. Behind them came Doc Holliday, pale as a ghost, his long coat fluttering in the breeze, a shotgun hidden beneath it. He looked half dead, but his smile carried the confidence of a man who already accepted the cost of what was about to happen. Word had spread that the Clantons and McClorys were armed and waiting near the OK Corral, spoiling for blood. Ike Clanton had been raving drunk the night before, threatening to kill every Earp in sight. Now, as the sun climbed higher, it was time to see if he meant it. The four men walked in silence, the sound of their boots echoing down Fremont Street. Townsfolk peered out from windows and doorways, whispering, stepping aside as the lawman passed. Every man in Tombstone knew this was no arrest. They were marching toward a reckoning. When they turned the corner onto Fremont, the cowboys were already there. Ike and Billy Clanton, Frank and Tom McClory, and Billy Claiborne, shifting nervously behind them. They stood in a ragged line near the lot behind the OK Corral, hands twitching near their pistols, eyes burning with hate and fear. Wyatt could see it. The tension, the uncertainty. Men like the Clantons talked loud, but when death stood 10 feet away, talk didn't mean much. For a moment, no one spoke. Just the creak of leather, the whisper of dust. Then Virgil stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "Throw up your hands," he ordered. "We want your guns." The cowboys shifted. Billy Clanton's jaw tightened, his hand hovering over the butt of his revolver. "We ain't doing anything," he growled. "We don't want to fight." Wyatt's eyes never left his face. He could see the lie trembling in Billy's fingers. "You've had your say," Wyatt said quietly. "Now, let's see if you've got the nerve to back it." The world seemed to hold its breath. A horse neighed somewhere far off. A church bell rang once, distant and hollow. Then, in a single, terrible instant, the silence shattered. Frank McClory's hand flashed and Doc Holliday's shotgun roared in answer. The street exploded in smoke and thunder. Bullets screamed through the air, kicking up splinters and dust. Morgan fired first, then Wyatt, each shot precise, controlled. Billy Clanton spun backward, his gun blazing wild as he fell. Tom McClory staggered from the blast of Doc's shotgun, blood soaking his shirt. Virgil's wounded arm jerked as he fired, the recoil forcing him back a step. The cowboys fired blindly, their faces twisted with panic. It was chaos. 20, maybe 30 seconds of pure fury. But in Wyatt's mind, it all slowed. He saw each muzzle flash, each spark in the air. He felt the shock of the revolver in his hand, the rhythm of death and survival beating like a drum. Frank McClory tried to run, clutching his side, turning to fire again. Wyatt stepped forward, calm, fearless. Frank's bullet tore through Wyatt's coat, grazing his side. Wyatt didn't flinch. He raised his Colt and fired once. Frank fell hard, the gun still clutched in his hand. Smoke filled the lot, thick and acrid. The echoes faded, leaving only the rasp of breathing and the faint crackle of wind-blown dust. When it was over, 3 cowboys lay dead or dying. Billy Clanton gasped for air, his revolver still warm. Tom and Frank McClory were motionless in the dirt. Ike Clanton, who had started the whole damn thing, was unarmed, crying, pleading, his courage gone like morning mist. Wyatt looked down at him with cold contempt. "Get out of here," he said flatly, "before you make me finish what you started." Ike ran, stumbling into the street, his sobs fading into the wind. Wyatt holstered his gun, the metal still hot against his hip. Virgil leaned on his good arm. Morgan stared at the bodies, and Doc was coughing hard, blood at the corner of his lips, but grinning through it all. "Well," he rasped, "this was a fine affair." "It's not over," Wyatt replied. "Not yet." The townspeople emerged slowly, eyes wide, whispers rippling through the streets. Some called it justice, others called it murder. But all agreed on one thing: the world had just changed. The gunfight at the OK Corral lasted barely half a minute, but it would echo for generations. As the smoke cleared, Wyatt looked at his brothers, at Doc, and then at the crimson stains spreading through the dust. He felt no triumph, no glory, just the heavy truth that every victory came with a price. In the distance, the wind carried the smell of gunpowder and death, the anthem of the West. He turned away, walking slowly toward the Oriental Saloon, each step heavier than the last. Behind him, Tombstone stood silent, holding its breath between legend and damnation. The winter of 1881 came down hard on Tombstone. The glory and noise that had followed the gunfight at the OK Corral were gone, replaced by something colder, meaner. The cowboys were scattered, but not broken. Their dead were buried. Their pride was not. Every saloon whisper, every pair of eyes that lingered too long told Wyatt Earp that the peace he'd fought for had turned to smoke. The town no longer looked at him as a lawman. They looked at him like a storm that had passed and left too much wreckage behind. Wyatt stayed close to his brothers. Virgil's arm was useless now, shattered by a shotgun blast a few weeks after the gunfight. Some said it was just bad luck, others said the cowboys had taken their first piece of revenge. Either way, Wyatt could see the fire fading from his brother's eyes. Morgan tried to laugh it off, saying the Earps were too stubborn to die easy, but the sound never reached his eyes. Wyatt, restless and grim, prowled the streets at night, checking corners, watching shadows. He'd seen enough of the West to know when trouble was gathering. And it was. One cold March evening in 1882, the storm finally broke. Wyatt and Morgan were shooting billiards at Campbell and Hatch's saloon. The lamps cast a warm glow over the green felt, the faint hum of a conversation drifting through the smoky air. Wyatt leaned over his cue, lining up a shot when the door creaked open. He didn't look up, didn't need to. He could feel it, that chill that comes before violence. Then the window behind Morgan shattered. A shotgun roared. The world turned white with sound. Morgan staggered, eyes wide, the cue dropping from his hand. He collapsed before Wyatt could reach him, blood spreading fast across his shirt. Someone screamed. Wyatt fell to his knees, pressing his hands against the wound, shouting his brother's name. Morgan tried to speak, but the words never came. Within minutes, he was gone. The bar emptied, the crowd spilling into the street, the night filled with shouting and running feet. But Wyatt didn't move. He just sat there beside the body, his face hollow, his hands slick with his brother's blood. The law would do nothing. Wyatt already knew that. The killers would vanish into the desert, protected by silence and fear. Justice, he realized, was just another card dealt by men with guns. Virgil came the next morning, pale and broken, and Wyatt told him flatly, "I'm done waiting on law." He meant it. The next days blurred together like a fever dream. Wyatt gathered what allies he had left. Doc Holliday, still coughing but loyal as ever. Texas Jack Vermillion, steady and sharp, and a handful of others who owed the Earps their lives. They didn't wear badges anymore. They didn't quote laws. They rode out under gray skies, cold and silent, each man carrying his own brand of vengeance. Wyatt led them west toward the San Pedro River, where word said the cowboys were holed up. He rode in silence, the wind stinging his face, the weight of his brother's death pressing on his chest like iron. He didn't pray, he didn't curse, he just rode. When they found their first target, Frank Stillwell, it was near the train station in Tucson. Wyatt and Doc caught him trying to board a car, laughing with another cowboy. Wyatt called his name once. Stillwell turned, surprise flickering across his face. Then Wyatt stepped forward and fired both barrels of his shotgun. The blast echoed off the walls, rolling across the desert like thunder. Stillwell dropped where he stood, his laughter dying with him. Wyatt reloaded slowly, eyes burning in the dim light. "Morgan sends his regards," he muttered. From that night on, the Vendetta Ride began. Wyatt and his men rode through canyons and riverbeds, striking fast and hard. Each dawn brought another name to cross off the list. Florentino Cruz, Curly Bill Brocious, Johnny Barnes, one by one, they fell. Wyatt had become something more than a man. He was a rumor in the wind, a shadow that brought death. The cowboys scattered before him, their camps abandoned, their fires left smoldering. In Tombstone, people whispered that Wyatt Earp had turned outlaw, that he'd lost his soul to the same darkness he once fought. Maybe they were right, but out there, in the dust and the blood, he found a kind of clarity that the law had never given him. Each night by the fire, Doc would study Wyatt through the smoke, his voice low and rasping. "You know, Wyatt," he said once, "there's no redemption at the end of this trail. Only ghosts." Wyatt didn't look up. "I already live with them," he said. By the time they reached the Dragoon Mountains, the ride had taken on the shape of a legend. They struck in silence, rode through gunfire, and vanished before dawn. Wyatt's coat was torn, his hat burned from a close shot, but he never slowed. Every time he looked into the distance, he could almost see Morgan walking beside him, smiling that easy smile, unburdened by pain or hate. That ghost drove him harder than any law ever had. When the killing was done, and the last cowboy lay dead in the dust, Wyatt stood over the body, his revolver heavy in his hand. The dawn light crept across the desert, painting everything in shades of red and gold. For the first time in weeks, he holstered his gun and looked to the horizon. "It's finished," he said softly. But it wasn't. Not really. The law would never forget what he'd done, and neither would the men who'd lost friends to his vengeance. Wyatt Earp had crossed a line, and there was no going back. He rode away from Arizona not as a lawman or a hero, but as something else entirely. a man who had tried to hold back the chaos of the frontier and finally become part of it. The legend of Wyatt Earp was born in blood and smoke, and as he disappeared into the desert dawn, even he couldn't tell where justice ended and vengeance began. The sun burned low over the desert as Wyatt Earp rode through the dying light, the wind clawing at his coat and the weight of vengeance pressing against his chest like a second heart. He hadn't spoken much in days. His men followed in silence. Doc Holliday, pale and coughing but unflinching. Sherman McMaster, quiet and watchful. Texas Jack Vermillion and Turkey Creek Johnson, both hardened by loss. They were ghosts now, riding through a country that no longer belonged to law or mercy. The Vendetta Ride was not about justice anymore. It was survival, wrath, and memory. Wyatt's brother was dead, his family broken, and the law had turned its back. The desert stretched wide before them, shimmering under the heat, a place where morality disappeared like footprints in sand. The first sign of their prey came at dawn. Scouts spotted a group of cowboys near Iron Springs, watering their horses in a shallow creek. Wyatt's hand tightened on the reins. He didn't need to speak. The men around him already knew what came next. They circled downwind, the dust muffling their approach. As they drew close, Wyatt dismounted, crouching behind a mesquite bush, eyes fixed on the figures by the water. Among them was Curly Bill Brocious, the man who laughed when Morgan's body hit the floor, who'd sworn Wyatt would never leave Arizona alive. The memory burned like whiskey in his gut. Wyatt rose slowly, shotgun in hand. The air held still, thick with waiting. "Curly Bill," he shouted. The cowboys spun in surprise. Before any could answer, Wyatt fired. The blast tore through the stillness, scattering the horses and sending men diving for cover. Gunfire erupted, bullets hissing past his head. He didn't flinch. He stepped into the open, his long coat snapping in the wind, and fired again. Curly Bill staggered, clutching his chest, blood spilling between his fingers. Wyatt kept walking, reloading as bullets struck the dirt around him, his face set in stone. The men behind him shouted, returning fire, but Wyatt never stopped moving. When the smoke cleared, the cowboys were gone, some dead, others vanished into the dust. Wyatt stood alone in the creek, water rippling red around his boots. He looked down at Curly Bill's body and exhaled, long and low. "You had your chance," he murmured. The others joined him moments later, their eyes wide with disbelief. Doc coughed, a rough laugh tearing from his throat. "You really are touched by the devil, Wyatt," he rasped. Wyatt just turned and walked back to his horse. "No," he said, "just tired of running." From that day forward, his name carried a different weight. He wasn't a marshal, wasn't a hero. He was a myth made of smoke and gunpowder. The stories spread faster than the dust. Some said he couldn't be killed, that no bullet would touch him. Others swore they'd seen him ride straight through gunfire without flinching. Wyatt didn't care what they said. He only knew that every mile he rode took him farther from the man he used to be. The ride stretched on for weeks. They hunted the last of the cowboys through canyons, across dry riverbeds, through ghost towns where only the wind dared speak. The men they killed were outlaws, killers, but Wyatt had stopped pretending it was justice. It was balance, perhaps, or maybe just obsession. Each time a man fell, Wyatt felt less and less human, as though the desert itself was swallowing him whole. At night, when the fire burned low, Doc would pour whiskey into a tin cup and pass it across. "You think it ends when they're all gone?" he'd ask. Wyatt never answered. He'd stare into the flames, watching the smoke twist into faces he knew. Morgan, Virgil before the limp, his father's stern gaze. The ghosts of his life stared back, silent and unforgiving. By the time spring came, the Vendetta Ride had burned itself out. The cowboys were finished. The Earp name was whispered with both fear and awe. But the territory's lawmen, those still alive, wanted Wyatt gone. There were warrants out, talk of federal pursuit. He'd crossed too many lines, spilled too much blood in the name of family. When he finally turned his horse north, heading toward Colorado, the desert seemed to exhale behind him, as if relieved. The men who rode with him peeled off one by one, heading their own ways. Only Doc stayed close for a while longer, until the sickness in his lungs became too much to ignore. In a quiet camp beneath a dying moon, Doc looked across the fire and said, "You'll outlive us all, Wyatt. Maybe that's your punishment." Wyatt didn't argue. He just nodded, eyes lost in the distance. The flames flickered across his face, carving him into something older, something carved from dust and regret. The next morning, he woke to find Doc gone, his trail leading south toward the sanitariums of Colorado Springs. Wyatt sat for a long time, staring at the empty saddle beside his own, before finally mounting up. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stop. Behind him, the desert whispered his story, twisting it into legend, shaping it into something bigger than truth. They'd call him a lawman, an avenger, a killer. Maybe he was all of those things. Maybe none. But as he rode into the pale dawn, alone, the first light catching the brim of his hat, Wyatt Earp became what the West always demanded. A man who lived long enough to see his own myth born from the ashes of what he'd lost. The years rolled by like dust across the plains, and the West that Wyatt Earp had known began to vanish. The gunfighters, gamblers, and outlaws faded into memory, replaced by telegraphs, railroads, and men in suits who talked about progress. Wyatt wandered from boomtown to boomtown, chasing what was left of the frontier: Silver City, San Diego, Nome, and finally Los Angeles, where the wild had been tamed and the law wore polished shoes instead of spurs. He was older now, his hair gray beneath his hat, the lines on his face carved deep like canyon walls. But his eyes, those cold blue eyes, still carried the weight of every sunrise he'd survived. The world moved on without him, but legends have a way of refusing to die. Some nights he'd sit alone by the pier in the fading light, watching the waves and thinking about Tombstone, the gun smoke, the screams, the heat of the day when everything changed. People called him a hero, others a murderer. But Wyatt knew the truth was never that simple. "Law," he once muttered to a young reporter, "is just the name folks give to the winning side." In Los Angeles, the new dream was motion pictures. The streets were lined with studios and cameras instead of saloons and guns. It was there that Wyatt found something unexpected: fame reborn through fiction. The young cowboy actors treated him like a relic of another age, a living story come to life. Men like William S. Hart and a young John Ford sought him out, eager to hear the tales of Tombstone straight from the man who'd lived them. They sat around him, hanging on every word as he spoke of Doc Holliday, of the OK Corral, of the ride for vengeance that turned men into myths. Sometimes he'd soften the truth, make it cleaner, simpler, because the world preferred stories to scars. But deep down, Wyatt knew the truth didn't matter anymore. People didn't want the man. They wanted the legend. When Doc died years before, Wyatt never shed a tear. But one night, sitting outside his bungalow in the cold glow of a California sunset, he whispered to the wind, "I told you you'd go first." The wind didn't answer, but he swore he heard laughter, low, dry, and familiar. The ghosts were still with him. Virgil, Morgan, Curly Bill, even Ike Clanton. They drifted through his dreams like tumbleweeds, never staying long but never gone. Each one asked the same silent question: was it worth it? Wyatt never found the answer. He'd built his life on the edge of a blade, chasing an idea of justice that might never have existed. But in the quiet of old age, as the world turned to film and fantasy, he began to wonder if maybe the legend of Wyatt Earp was the truest justice he'd ever find. Because legends, unlike men, never die. They just change shape. In January of 1929, the last lawman of the Old West breathed his final breath. There was no gunfire, no galloping horse, no echo of the OK Corral, just the soft hiss of rain on the Los Angeles streets. Beside his bed sat Josephine, his lifelong companion, holding his hand. On the dresser rested his old Colt revolver, cleaned and silent, as though waiting for one last call. Outside, the world was changing. Silent films turning to sound, cowboys becoming stars. A week later, a small crowd gathered at his funeral. Some came to honor a lawman. Others came to see the myth laid to rest. None truly knew the man who'd outlived his own legend. Years later, Hollywood would turn his life into stories. Tales of bravery, loyalty, and revenge. They'd polish the grit, paint him in gold and glory, and call him a hero of the West. And maybe that was fine. Maybe the truth didn't belong to Wyatt anymore. It belonged to everyone who still dreamed of justice riding beneath a burning sun. Because even if he'd never been perfect, even if his hands were stained with blood, Wyatt Earp had done something most men never could. He carved his name into history with iron and fire, and he never backed down. The sea wind carried his memory beyond Los Angeles, across deserts and plains, through ghost towns and movie screens. Somewhere out there, the West still lived, in the echo of hooves, in the glint of a six-shooter, in the spirit of a man who refused to be forgotten. Wyatt Earp wasn't just a name. He was the heartbeat of an era that refused to die. And as the last light of the frontier faded into legend, his story became a mirror for everyone who ever stood up when the world turned dark. So if you ever find yourself standing where justice feels out of reach, remember the man who didn't wait for the law to come. Remember the one who rode into the fire and made his own peace with the devil. Wyatt Earp's West may be gone, but his spirit still rides. Like the wind over the desert, it whispers a challenge to anyone brave enough to listen. Don't just live. Become the legend they'll talk about when the dust settles.